This happened a few weeks ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I live in a quiet suburb in Delaware, but I'm a sophomore in college out in California. This happened during fall break in October, when I was back home for a few days. I come home every chance I can, which honestly always feels a little bittersweet. I love seeing my parents, but they're really traditional, which can be suffocating. One of the things that drives me crazy is how uptight they are about weed. Even though it's recently been legalized here, they lose their minds if they knew I smoked. They've never really gotten used to the idea that I'm an adult now. I can't really understand their position on the whole thing, but at the end of the day, they are my parents, and I would never disrespect them, especially while I'm under their roof. Whenever I'm home, I have to sneak around to avoid getting caught. I hate to admit it, but sneaking around my parents is a skill I've mastered over the years. I can't even count the number of times I've snuck out of the house late at night, let alone all the other mischief I used to do. My dad has the nose of a bloodhound, so smoking inside isn't an option. Thankfully, my old treehouse is still standing in the front yard. My parents built it for me when I was a kid, and even though it's weathered and creaky in some spots, it's held up surprisingly well. It's high enough in the trees that it's basically hidden from view, especially from the house. From up there, I can see everything. The yard, the street, some windows of the house. But no one can see me unless they know exactly where to look. When I was younger, that treehouse was a place I went when I needed to escape, which, if you knew what I was like as a child, was relatively often. It's honestly kind of hard to talk about with all the old memories flooding back, but I'll get to the point. On the Saturday before I was supposed to fly back to school, my parents were out at some banquet or something that was going to run late into the evening. I knew they wouldn't be home for hours, but I didn't know exactly when they'd be returning. I didn't want to risk getting caught in the backyard, so I climbed up into the treehouse with my stash, just to be safe. It was chilly out, and I could see my own breath in the air. I have this theory that cold weather induces more nostalgia, but that might just be me. It was quiet and peaceful up there, and it was nice being the only one around. I've always liked being up high, too, so that definitely added to the experience. I watched the sunset as I thought about school, excited to go back. By the time I finished, it was mostly dark outside, meaning I had timed things just right. That's when I noticed it. As I was panning my eyes across the yard, a light turned on in the house. I froze, knowing I was the only one home. My heart started racing as I stared at the window, feeling that instinctual sense of fear that only arises from true danger. My field of vision began closing in around that single source of light, as if it were drawing me in. A few moments later, movement in the backyard snapped me out of my disassociative state. 3 hooded figures were circling the property, clearly trying to move quickly. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. I watched as the 3 figures moved to the front steps. That's when a 4th figure opened the door and let them in. My chest tightened as it hit me. My house was being robbed. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't look away. Part of me was still frozen, and another part of me was still trying to convince myself that what I was seeing was real. That's the best way I can explain what I was feeling in that moment. One of the figures stayed outside, pacing the yard. I think some subconscious part of me clicked, because I looked down and my phone was in my hand, open to the keypad on my phone app. Without thinking, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I told the operator what was happening and hung up, but as I was putting my phone away, the light from the screen must have caught the guy's eye, because he whipped his head to look up into the trees. I ducked, but I was worried he had seen me. Not 3 seconds. When I was a kid, I had a very nightmarish experience at my childhood home. My family moved to this house when I was like 4, so I really don't remember anything of the house we lived in when I was born. We lived in what I call my childhood house from when I was 4 to when I was 14, so exactly 10 years. I love that house. I have very good memories from growing up there. We moved out of state when I was just beginning high school, which was a nightmare in of itself. But that's nothing to do with this story. In the backyard of my childhood home was a treehouse. It was built by the previous owner for his kids. Believe it or not, when my parents viewed the house, a major selling point was the kid-friendly nature of the house and the backyard. For my older brother and me, my brother Kyle is 2 years older than me, so he was 6 when they bought the house, and my brother and I apparently were very excited over the treehouse aspect in the backyard. According to my parents, my brother and I would play in the treehouse with friends we'd made over the years, but as the years passed, I would stop playing in the treehouse like that. At a certain age, by the age of 12, I was obviously not playing in the treehouse anymore, but I was admittedly a troublemaker around this age, and I would often get in trouble with my parents. I'd get grounded often, and in general, I'd just throw a lot of temper tantrums, and there would be a lot of yelling in the house. One weekend, my dad grounded me for a repeat complaint from my guidance counselor about my behavior and grades in school, and like an angsty, annoying preteen, I thought I hated my parents at that moment. That night, I refused to sleep in the house. I took a couple of blankets and pillows and went outside to the treehouse to sleep up there. It wasn't the first time I'd done this, and my parents would know about it when I did it. They didn't care. It was my little way of rebelling. Little did my dad know that I had my Nintendo DS with me, even though I wasn't allowed to play video games or watch TV. I played Animal Crossing for literally hours before getting tired and eventually going to sleep. But I think I was only asleep for a few moments. I don't think I even entered REM sleep. Yet when I woke up to a voice from outside calling my name, Tommy, Tommy, I was still confused as I was waking back up. It could have been my dad's voice. "Tommy, are you up there?" the voice said. All I remember is it being a deep, grown man's voice. I didn't reply. My heart started to race for some reason. I heard the steps of the ladder squeaking as someone was coming up, and then, in the near pitch-black darkness, I saw someone poke their head through the opening in the floor. I couldn't see their face. I just saw the shadow of the outline of their head. He said, "There you are." I replied, "Dad." But this was where he stopped responding entirely for about 20 seconds. I stared at this head that I presume was staring back at me. I was waiting for my eyes to readjust to the darkness, but something told me that that wasn't my dad. I stood up and went to the window of the treehouse and started screaming, "Dad," as loud as I could. I saw the light in my parents' room turn on, and I also heard footsteps hurrying down the ladder to the treehouse. Moments later, my parents burst outside through the back door, and my dad swore to me that he wasn't out there playing a prank on me. My parents believed me. It wasn't like some stupid horror movie where the parents don't believe a word the kid says. My uncle was still an active cop at the time, and so my dad called him for advice, and my uncle made a report on the incident the next day. Not much information I could give besides I heard a deep man's voice and saw the outline of his head, and that he knew my name. Not much the police could work with, obviously. I never spent a night in the treehouse again. My dad, for a while, thought it was one of the neighbors directly across from us, but he could never prove it. For years, whenever I'd see him outside and he'd say hi to me, I'd try to think back to the voice from that night, but I just couldn't remember it clearly enough to make a comparison. It still remains a very unsettling mystery in the back of my mind.